The forest had been whispering warnings for 3 days before Theron Blackthorn finally decided to investigate. As the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, he had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now every fiber of his being screamed that something had shifted in the ancient woods bordering his kingdom. The Forbidden Forest, as his people called it, had always been a place of dark legends and darker truths, a tangled wilderness where even the bravest warriors feared to tread. For generations, an unspoken treaty had existed between his kind and whatever dwelled in those shadowed depths. The wolves did not enter, and whatever lived within did not emerge. But 3 nights ago, that delicate balance had shattered when his border patrols reported impossible things. Trees moving of their own accord, paths that vanished and reappeared, and a haunting melody that seemed to emanate from the very soil itself. Theron stood at the forest's edge now, his silver eyes narrowed against the morning mist that clung to the ground like grasping fingers. Behind him, his elite guard waited in tense silence, hands resting on weapons they hoped they would not need to use. He was a massive figure even among his kind, standing well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of an entire kingdom, which he had done for the past decade since taking the throne in blood and fire. His hair was black as a raven's wing, falling to his shoulders in waves that he kept tied back with a leather cord, and his face bore the sharp, predatory features that marked him as pure alpha bloodline, all harsh angles and unforgiving lines. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, a permanent reminder of the night he had killed his father and ended a reign of corruption that had nearly destroyed their people. The melody grew louder as he stepped across the threshold into the forest, and immediately the temperature dropped, the air becoming thick with magic so old it tasted of copper and moss on his tongue. His wolf stirred restlessly beneath his skin, not in aggression, but in recognition, as if some ancient part of him remembered this place from before memory, from the time when his ancestors had first learned to walk on 2 legs and call themselves civilized. The trees here were unlike those in any other forest, their trunks wider than 10 men standing shoulder to shoulder, their branches reaching so high they seemed to scrape the belly of the sky itself. Moss hung from them like the beards of forgotten gods, and mushrooms glowed with bioluminescent light in the perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. Theron had brought only his 5 most trusted warriors, men who had fought beside him through countless battles and proved their loyalty with more than mere words. They moved through the undergrowth with predatory grace, making no sound despite their size, reading the forest for threats the way other men might read a book. But the forest was not threatening them, Theron realized with growing unease. It was watching them, studying them with the patient curiosity of something that had seen empires rise and fall like the changing of seasons. Every shadow seemed to hold eyes. Every rustle of leaves felt deliberate, and the very air hummed with a presence that made his skin prickle with awareness. They had been walking for perhaps an hour, when Marcus, his beta and oldest friend, raised a fist in the signal for silence. Ahead, through a break, in the trees, golden light spilled into a clearing that should not exist, its edges too perfect, too circular, as if someone had taken a giant blade and carved a space from the forest's heart. What Theron saw in that clearing would haunt him for the rest of his immortal life. A young woman danced in the center of the glade, her movements fluid and otherworldly, her bare feet barely touching the carpet of wildflowers that bloomed in impossible profusion around her. She wore a simple dress that looked woven from spider silk and moonlight, clinging to curves that made his wolf sit up and take notice despite the wrongness of the entire situation. Her hair fell in waves of deep auburn past her waist, threaded through with what appeared to be living vines that moved with a will of their own, weaving themselves into intricate braids and releasing themselves in an endless, hypnotic cycle. But it was her eyes that stole the breath from his lungs when she turned and pinned him with a gaze that held all the wisdom of the forest itself. They were silver, not the pale silver of his own wolfish heritage, but a deep, luminous silver like starlight reflected in still water, with pupils that seemed to shift between round and vertical, depending on how the light caught them. She was beautiful, in the way that poisonous things are beautiful, the way a blade is beautiful, all dangerous edges wrapped in a package designed to make men forget themselves and their purpose. Around her, the forest was alive in ways that defied nature and sanity. Flowers bloomed and withered in rapid succession, their petals falling like colorful snow only to be reabsorbed by the earth and birth new blossoms seconds later. Vines crawled across the ground like serpents, arranging themselves in patterns that hurt to look at too long, sacred geometry that predated written language. And the trees, those ancient sentinels, bent toward her like courtiers bowing before a queen, their branches reaching down as if to caress her hair, their roots breaking through the soil to create a living throne at her back. Theron felt his wolf surge forward, demanding to be released, to claim, to conquer, to possess. But he held it back with iron will forged through years of brutal self-discipline. This was no ordinary Omega stumbling through his territory, no helpless female in need of protection or punishment. This was something else entirely, something his legend spoke of only in whispers and warnings. The girl stopped dancing when she noticed him, tilting her head in a gesture that was distinctly inhuman despite her appearance, studying him with those impossible eyes that seemed to see straight through flesh and bone to the tarnished soul beneath. She did not scream or run as any sensible creature would when confronted by 6 massive werewolves bristling with weapons and hostile intent. Instead, she smiled. And that smile held such ancient amusement that Theron felt suddenly, uncomfortably young, despite his 2 centuries of existence. When she spoke, her voice was layered, as if a dozen throats spoke in harmony. The sound of wind through leaves and water over stones, and the deep groan of wood under pressure, all blended into something that approximated human speech. She asked who dared enter the heart of the forest without permission, who thought themselves mighty enough to walk where even the bravest of his kind had learned to fear. The language was old, older than the common tongue his people spoke, but Theron understood it in his bones, in the blood that remembered when wolves and forest had been one and the same. He stepped forward, separating himself from his guards in a display of dominance that made Marcus hiss a warning, and met her otherworldly gaze with the full weight of his authority. He introduced himself not with the pompous titles he had acquired, not as king or conqueror or the breaker of chains, but simply as Theron, Alpha of the Northern Territories, and asked for the courtesy of her name in return. The girl laughed, and the sound made flowers burst into bloom around her feet, made the trees shiver with what might have been pleasure or fear. She said that names had power, especially in places like this where the old magic still ran strong, and asked why she should give him such a weapon when he had entered her domain with steel and suspicion. Theron felt a flicker of something that might have been respect warming the perpetual ice around his heart. She was clever, this strange creature. Clever and cautious, despite the display of power that surrounded her like an aura. He sheathed his blade, the scrape of metal against leather loud in the clearing's unnatural silence, and spread his hands to show he meant no immediate threat, though they both knew he could shift and rip her apart in seconds if he chose. He explained that his patrols had reported disturbances, magic spilling over into his lands, and as Alpha it was his duty to investigate anything that might threaten his people. He said he sought only understanding, though even as the words left his mouth, he tasted the lie in them. What he sought was control, dominance, the reassurance that nothing in his territory existed beyond his knowledge and command. The girl studied him for a long moment, long enough that sweat began to bead on his skin despite the cool air, long enough that his warriors shifted restlessly behind him, hands moving toward weapons in response to the rising tension. Then she nodded, a gesture so human it was jarring after everything else, and said she would give him a name if he promised safe passage back to his lands. She said the forest protected her because she asked it to, because they were bound together in ways he could not comprehend, but that she meant no harm to his people so long as they respected the boundaries that had stood for countless generations. Theron agreed, sealing the promise with the weight of his alpha authority, feeling the words sink into his bones the way all oaths did when spoken with true intent. The girl seemed satisfied, or perhaps amused, and finally offered the name Silviana, spoken like a sigh, like the rustle of leaves, like something that belonged to the earth itself, rather than any person. She said she had lived in the forest for as long as she could remember, since before memory became clear, raised by the trees and the creatures that called the darkness home. She claimed to be nothing special, just an Omega who had been abandoned as a child and found sanctuary where others saw only danger. But Theron was not fooled by her modest words. Not when the forest continued to bow and sway around her. Not when he could feel power radiating from her small form, like heat from a forge. He asked what she was, cutting through the pretense with the bluntness that had made him both respected and feared among his kind. Silviana's smile faded, replaced by an expression of genuine confusion that made her appear younger, more vulnerable, more human. She said she did not know, that she had always been different, always felt the forest's heartbeat, as if it were her own, always been able to coax plants to grow and animals to trust, and the very earth to reshape itself at her request. She said she had assumed it was simply magic, the wild kind that occasionally manifested in abandoned pups, who survived against all odds, adaptation forged by necessity. But even as she spoke, Theron saw the doubt in those silver eyes, the unspoken questions that haunted her, the terrible loneliness of being singular in a world that demanded you fit into predetermined categories. Marcus interrupted with a warning growl, his eyes fixed on the tree line where shadows had begun to gather, taking on almost solid form, responding to some unspoken call from deeper in the forest. The clearing's atmosphere shifted, the gentle curiosity replaced by something more primal, more protective, more dangerous. Silviana turned toward the approaching shadows and spoke in that layered voice again, words that made Theron's ears ring and his wolf whimper with instinctive recognition of something far up the predatory chain. The shadows retreated like chastised children, melting back into the undergrowth, but not before Theron caught a glimpse of forms that were neither beast nor tree, but something in between, creatures from the old stories that his people claimed had died out, when the world grew too loud and harsh for ancient things. He made a decision in that moment that would alter the course of both their lives, driven by curiosity and suspicion, and something deeper that his wolf recognized, even if his conscious mind refused to acknowledge it. He told Silviana that she would come with him to his palace, that he needed to understand what she was, and ensure she posed no threat to his people. He phrased it as a request, but left no room for refusal, letting his alpha command seep into the words, expecting her to submit as all Omegas did when confronted with dominant authority. Instead, Silviana laughed again, that beautiful, terrible sound, and told him that she was not one of his pack wolves to be ordered about like a subordinate. She said the forest would not allow her to be taken against her will, that he would find his warriors torn apart by roots and branches before they could lay hands on her. The standoff lasted 3 heartbeats, 3 impossible seconds where Theron prepared for violence, and Silviana gathered the forest's power around her like a cloak, the air crackling with opposing forces about to collide. Then she surprised him again by agreeing to come willingly, on one condition. She demanded his word as alpha that she would be treated as a guest rather than a prisoner, free to leave whenever she chose, bound by hospitality rather than chains. Theron found himself agreeing before his tactical mind could analyze the foolishness of giving such a promise to an unknown entity. Compelled by something he refused to examine too closely, by the weight of those silver eyes and the strange pull in his chest that felt suspiciously like the mate bond his people whispered about, but he had always dismissed as romantic nonsense. They left the clearing with Silviana walking between his warriors like a queen among guards, rather than a captive among captors, and behind them the forest sang a mournful song that sounded like goodbye, or perhaps a promise that she would return. The journey back to his palace took hours, and Theron used the time to observe his unusual guest, noting the way she moved with inhuman grace, the way small animals approached her without fear, the way plants seemed to perk up as she passed, as if drawing energy from her mere presence. She asked questions in return, simple things about his kingdom and people, displaying a naivete about werewolf society that suggested her isolation had been complete. She had not known there were different ranks among his kind, had not understood the concept of packs and alphas and the complex hierarchies that governed their world. She had thought herself simply human, albeit one with strange abilities, never imagining that the blood in her veins might carry echoes of something far older than humanity or wolf. The palace rose from the landscape like a fortress carved from the bones of the mountain itself, all dark stone and sharp towers, a monument to power and paranoia built by generations of alpha kings who understood that strength alone kept chaos at bay. Theron watched Silviana's face as they approached, looking for signs of intimidation or fear, but found only curiosity and something that might have been sadness. She commented that it looked lonely, this great pile of stone divorced from living earth, and asked how anyone could bear to live surrounded by dead things when the world outside pulsed with life. The observation cut deeper than any insult could have, striking at truths Theron had spent decades trying to ignore. The reality that his palace was indeed a tomb for the living, beautiful and cold, and utterly devoid of warmth. His people lined the courtyards as news of his return spread. Hundreds of wolves in human form come to catch a glimpse of whatever their king had dragged from the forbidden forest. Theron heard the whispers, felt the fear and speculation ripple through the crowd, saw hands moving in warding gestures passed down from ancient times when his kind had believed in gods and monsters beyond their own. Silviana seemed oblivious to the hostile attention, her focus drawn to a small garden struggling to survive in the palace's shadow, beds of flowers and herbs tended by the palace gardeners with limited success in the harsh climate. She broke away from the group before anyone could stop her, crossing to the nearest bed where roses struggled to produce blooms in the thin soil. She knelt among them, heedless of the dirt staining her strange dress, and began to hum that haunting melody from the forest. Theron and his entire court watched in stunned silence as the roses responded to her song, their stems thickening, leaves growing lush and green, buds forming and opening in a cascade of crimson and gold that should have taken weeks compressed into minutes. The gardeners gasped, falling to their knees in reverence or terror, while the warriors reached for weapons they would not know how to use against this kind of power. Silviana stood, brushing dirt from her hands with an expression of satisfaction, and turned to find Theron staring at her with an intensity that made her take an involuntary step back. He asked what she had done, knowing the answer, but needing to hear it from her lips, needing confirmation that this was real and not some elaborate hallucination brought on by exhaustion or dark magic. She said she had simply helped them grow, given them strength and encouragement, the same thing she did for all plants that called to her for aid. She seemed genuinely confused by the reaction her casual display of impossible power had provoked, looking around at the sea of shocked faces with growing unease. Theron realized in that moment that she truly did not understand what she was, had no concept of how fundamentally her existence violated every natural law his people understood. He made another decision, this one more calculated than the first, and announced to his assembled court that Silviana was to be treated as his personal guest, under his protection, and anyone who harmed or harassed her would answer to him directly. The threat in his voice was unmistakable, backed by 2 centuries of violence and a reputation for creative cruelty toward those who defied him. The crowd dispersed with reluctant obedience, though Theron caught the calculating looks from certain court members, the ones who would see opportunity in chaos, who would wonder if this strange creature could be weaponized or exploited for political gain. He assigned Silviana rooms in the tower adjacent to his own, ostensibly for her safety, but truthfully, so he could keep close watch on her, monitor her movements and actions. The quarters were lavish by any standard, furnished with the finest textiles and woods his kingdom could provide, but they felt lifeless compared to the vibrant clearing where he had found her. Silviana explored the space with evident discomfort, running her fingers over smooth marble and polished metal, materials that nature had not intended, shaped by fire and force rather than grown with patience and care. She asked if there were windows that opened, explaining that she had never slept enclosed by walls, that the thought of being separated from the sky made her chest tight with an anxiety she could not name. Theron ordered the heavy shutters thrown open, letting in the mountain air and the distant sound of wind through trees, hoping it would ease her distress. He found himself wanting to comfort her, to smooth away the furrow between her brows, and the impulse irritated him beyond measure. He had not survived his brutal upbringing by being soft, had not taken the throne by showing mercy, and he refused to become weak now over a pair of silver eyes and a sad smile. He left her in the care of Lyra, one of his few female warriors, and someone he trusted to both protect and observe, instructing his beta to have all healers and scholars report to him immediately. If Silviana would not, or could not, explain what she was, then he would uncover the truth through research and deduction. The first 3 days of Silviana's residence in his palace tried Theron's patience in ways few things had managed. She refused to stay in her rooms despite his orders, wandering the corridors and grounds with complete disregard for protocol or safety. He found her in the kitchens helping the cooks prepare meals, coaxing better flavor from vegetables with a touch of her hand. He found her in the training yards, sparring with young warriors who should have known better than to encourage her, moving with a fluid grace that suggested she had learned to fight not from instructors, but from watching predators hunt in the wild. He found her in the palace library, surrounded by ancient texts, struggling to read language she only barely understood, trying to educate herself about the world beyond her forest sanctuary. Each time he attempted to confine her, to establish boundaries and rules, she would smile that knowing smile and remind him of his promise to treat her as guest rather than prisoner. And each time he found himself unable to press the issue, stopped by something that felt suspiciously like honor. His scholars and healers examined her with instruments and spells, measuring her essence and probing her magic, but their findings only deepened the mystery. She possessed no wolf, that much was certain, her spirit unmarked by the dual nature that defined his kind. Her magic was unlike anything in their records, predating even the oldest werewolf bloodlines, rooted in something far more primal than the moon's call that had birthed his species. One ancient scholar, a wolf so old his fur had turned white and his eyes had gone milky with cataracts, spoke a word that Theron had believed belonged only to myth and faded legend. Silvani, he wheezed, children of the first forest, beings who existed before gods walked the earth. When magic was wild and undefined, they were said to be guardians of the natural world, immortal and powerful, capable of commanding all living things with nothing more than will and whisper. But the Silvani had died out, Theron argued, hunted to extinction 1,000 years ago, when the werewolves and other shifter species had emerged and began claiming territory that had once belonged solely to the forest folk. The scholar shook his head, suggesting that perhaps they had not died, but merely hidden, retreated into the deepest wilderness where none would think to look, their numbers dwindling until only scattered survivors remained, isolated and unaware of their own heritage. If Silviana was indeed one of these lost children, then she represented something invaluable and incredibly dangerous, a link to power that kingdoms would go to war to possess or destroy. Theron found himself standing outside her rooms that night, listening to her sing to the plants she had insisted on filling every available surface with, coaxing them to grow in this harsh environment through sheer force of will and affection. Her voice wound through the corridors like a living thing, beautiful and haunting, speaking to something in his soul that he had thought long dead. He entered without knocking, using the Alpha's prerogative to go where he pleased in his own palace, and found her sitting on the windowsill with moonlight, painting her skin silver and shadows pooling in the hollows of her throat. She did not seem surprised by his intrusion, had probably felt him, approaching through whatever strange senses she possessed, and simply patted the space beside her in invitation. Theron found himself sitting, despite every tactical instinct screaming that proximity to her was dangerous, that the strange pull he felt, growing stronger each day, was a threat to the carefully controlled existence he had built for himself. She asked about the scar through his eyebrow, the one that marked the night he had killed his father and seized the throne. Theron found himself telling her things he had never spoken aloud, about growing up under the rule of a tyrant who used fear and pain to control his pack, who saw his own son as competition rather than heir, who had been slowly destroying their people through corruption and cruelty. He told her about the final confrontation, about driving his claws through his father's heart and feeling nothing but cold satisfaction as the old king's blood pooled on the throne room floor. He told her about the years since. About struggling to build something better on foundations of violence and betrayal. About the constant vigilance required to keep ambitious wolves in line and neighboring kingdoms at bay. Silviana listened without judgment, her silver eyes reflecting moonlight like mirrors. And when he finished, she said something that cracked the armor around his heart just a little. She said that he carried his father's ghost like a weight on his shoulders, that every harsh decision and cold action was born from fear of becoming what he had destroyed, but that there was another path if he was brave enough to walk it. She said that strength without compassion was just cruelty wearing a different mask, and that true power came not from making others fear you, but from protecting those who could not protect themselves. Theron wanted to dismiss her words as the naive philosophy of someone who had never known real hardship, who had lived protected by the forest, and never faced the ugly realities of leadership. But he could not forget that she had survived alone in the wilderness from infancy, had raised herself in an environment that should have killed her, had learned to command powers she did not understand without anyone to guide her. She was far stronger than her soft exterior suggested, forged by solitude and necessity into something that could not be easily broken. The attack came on the 7th day of her residence, launched by a faction within his own court who saw opportunity in chaos. 3. Nobles who had never forgiven Theron for killing his father and disrupting the old order, who had been quietly gathering supporters for years, chose to make their move by attempting to kidnap Silviana and use her as leverage. They struck at dawn when security was at its lowest, using magic they should not have possessed to mask their approach and incapacitate the guards. They might have succeeded if Theron had not maintained his habit of sleeping lightly and keeping one ear always tuned to the palace's rhythms. The paranoia earned through too many assassination attempts to count. He erupted from his rooms with a roar that shook windows in their frames, his wolf surging forward in a partial shift that left him caught between man and beast, the most dangerous form he could achieve. He found the conspirators in Silviana's chambers, their hands already reaching for her, triumph written on their faces at having captured such a prize. But they had not accounted for what Silviana herself could do, had assumed that because she seemed gentle and confused, she would be helpless. The vines she had been nurturing throughout her stay erupted from their pots with violent force, wrapping around the attackers' limbs and throats, squeezing with enough pressure to make bones creak and flesh bruise. Roots punched up through the stone floor as if it were soft earth, creating a cage that held the conspirators suspended and helpless, their weapons falling from nerveless fingers. Silviana stood, in the center of the room, with her silver eyes blazing with power, and for the first time, Theron truly understood what she was, understood the mercy she showed every moment she chose not to unleash the full force of what she could do. The sight of her like that, terrible and beautiful, defending herself with power that could have leveled his entire palace if she chose, did something to the mate bond that Theron had been trying so hard to ignore. It snapped into place with almost physical force, a golden thread connecting his heart to hers, singing with rightness that made his wolf howl in triumph. He saw the moment she felt it too, saw her eyes widen and her hand press against her chest, as if trying to hold her heart inside her ribs. The conspirators were dealt with according to the ancient laws, exiled to the wilderness beyond his borders where they would either survive or die, according to their own strength and cunning. Theron announced their crimes publicly, using the opportunity to send a message about loyalty and the cost of betrayal. Though his thoughts remained fixed on the golden thread that now bound him to a creature he barely understood, Silviana retreated to her rooms after the incident and refused to see anyone, including him, for 2 full days. When she finally emerged, there were shadows under her eyes and a brittleness to her composure that suggested she had been doing her own wrestling with the impossible reality of what had happened. She found him in the throne room late at night, sitting in the massive chair carved from blackwood that had seen generations of Alpha Kings come and go. She asked if he felt it too, this connection that made her aware of his emotions as if they were her own, that made distance physically painful and proximity intoxicating. Theron admitted that he did, that the mate bond was real and undeniable, but that it meant complications neither of them might be ready to face. If you're enjoying this story of ancient power and impossible bonds, please leave a comment about which moment has captivated you most so far. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss these supernatural romance stories. Your support means everything to this channel. Silviana said she needed to understand what she was before she could even begin to process what they were together. That the bond felt like one more thing pulling her toward a destiny she had no say in choosing. Theron found himself agreeing to help her search for answers, assigning his best scholars to comb through archives and sending messengers to neighboring kingdoms, requesting access to their oldest records. The research took weeks, but gradually a picture emerged from fragments and forgotten stories. The Silvani had indeed been hunted nearly to extinction, not by werewolves as legend claimed, but by something far darker. A cabal of dark mages had sought to harvest Silvani essence for immortality spells, believing that beings connected so deeply to life itself held the secret to cheating death. They had hunted the forest folk systematically, killing most and driving the survivors into hiding so deep that even memory of them had faded into myth. Silviana learned that her kind had once numbered in thousands, spread across every forest and wild place in the world, maintaining the balance between civilization and nature. They had been teachers and healers, using their connection to the earth to help crops grow and sickness fade, asking nothing in return but respect for the wild places that birthed them. When the hunting began, the Silvani had fought back with power that reshaped landscapes and toppled kingdoms, but ultimately their gentle nature had been their downfall. They could not sustain the kind of prolonged violence needed to win a war, could not harden their hearts enough to match the ruthless efficiency of those who sought their destruction. The revelation of her heritage hit Silviana hard, sending her into a spiral of grief. For a people she had never known, for a culture and history stolen from her before she could even form memories. She spent days wandering the forest bordering Theron's palace, communing with the trees and earth, trying to feel some connection to the ancestors she would never meet. Theron found himself following her on these excursions, maintaining a respectful distance, but always close enough to intervene if danger threatened. He watched her grieve and rage, and slowly find acceptance. Watched her begin to embrace the power she had always possessed but never fully understood. She experimented with her abilities under his watchful eye, learning that she could accelerate plant growth to incredible speeds, that she could communicate with animals in ways that went beyond simple empathy, that she could sense the health of ecosystems and pinpoint sources of corruption or disease. She could even manipulate earth and stone if she concentrated hard enough, though it exhausted her in ways that working with living things did not. Theron began to see the strategic value in what she could do, the ways her power could be used to strengthen his kingdom, improve agriculture, defend against invasions. But every time his thoughts turned tactical, he would catch himself and remember her words about strength without compassion being just another form of cruelty. She was not a weapon to be wielded, not a resource to be exploited. And the fact that he kept having to remind himself of that truth was proof of how damaged his upbringing had left him. The relationship between them shifted and deepened through those weeks of discovery, the mate bond pulling them together, while their individual fears and doubts pushed them apart. They fell into a pattern of spending evenings together, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence while she tended her plants, and he worked through the endless paperwork that came with ruling a kingdom. Silviana slowly began to trust him with pieces of her past, telling him about growing up alone in the forest, about the loneliness of having no one who understood her, about the fear that she was broken or wrong somehow, because she did not fit into any category she knew. Theron found himself sharing in return, telling her about the brutal training his father had subjected him to, about watching other young wolves broken by the old king's rages, about the guilt he carried for not acting sooner, for all the suffering he might have, prevented if he had been braver or stronger when it mattered. Silviana listened to these confessions. With the same lack of judgment she showed everything, and slowly, painfully, Theron began to understand that she saw him not as the monster he believed himself to be, but as someone who had survived trauma and was trying, however imperfectly, to build something better. She challenged him when he made decisions out of fear rather than wisdom, called him out when he defaulted to threats and intimidation instead of communication. She was not afraid of him the way everyone else was, and that fearlessness was simultaneously terrifying and liberating. The turning point came when Theron's neighboring kingdom to the east launched a surprise invasion, seeking to take advantage of what they perceived as weakness and distraction. The enemy Alpha, a brutal warlord named Darian who had built his power through conquest and slavery, led the attack personally, with 5,000 warriors at his back. Theron met them at the border with his own forces, and for 3 days the battle raged across the foothills, turning the earth red with blood and filling the air with the sounds of dying wolves. Silviana, against Theron's explicit orders, left the palace and came to the battlefield, arriving as the 4th day dawned and Theron's forces were beginning to falter under the relentless assault. She walked onto the killing field, like vengeance incarnate, her silver eyes blazing with power, and, for the first time in her life, Silviana embraced the full scope of what she could do. The earth itself responded to her fury, roots erupting from the ground to entangle enemy warriors, trees bending their branches into weapons that struck with deadly precision. She created barriers of living wood that no blade could penetrate, summoned thorns that grew fast enough to pierce armor and flesh, turned the landscape itself into an ally that fought alongside Theron's wolves with devastating efficiency. The enemy forces broke and ran, their confidence shattered by power they had no defense against, and Darian himself fled back across the border with barely a third of his army still intact. Theron found Silviana in the aftermath, kneeling among the fallen with tears streaming down her face, using the last of her strength to heal those who could still be saved, both his warriors and the enemy wounded alike. He carried her back to the palace himself, refusing to let anyone else touch her, feeling the mate bond, singing with pride and terror, and something that might have been love. She slept for 2 full days, her body exhausted from channeling so much power, and Theron barely left her side, dismissing all but the most urgent business to keep vigil over her recovery. When she finally woke, the first thing she said was that she was sorry for disobeying his orders, but that she could not have stayed safe in the palace while he and his people fought and died. Theron found himself unable to summon anger, too relieved that she lived to care about her disregard for his authority. He told her that she had saved countless lives, that her intervention had turned certain defeat into decisive victory, and that he was in her debt. Silviana laughed weakly and said that mates did not keep score, that what was his was hers, and what was hers was his, if they chose to accept the bond fully. The question hung between them, heavy with implication and terrifying in its permanence. Theron had spent a lifetime avoiding emotional entanglement, believing that connection was liability, that love made you weak and vulnerable. But looking at Silviana, seeing the strength and compassion that existed side by side in her, he began to wonder if perhaps he had been wrong about everything. Maybe strength came not from isolation, but from having something worth protecting. Maybe vulnerability was not weakness, but courage, the willingness to let someone see all your flaws and trust they would stay anyway. He took her hand, feeling the calluses earned from a lifetime of climbing trees and digging in soil, and told her that he wanted to try, to see if a monster could learn to be something more when someone believed he was capable of it. The acceptance of the mate bond was not the magical transformation fairy tales suggested, but rather the beginning of hard work. They argued about how to rule his kingdom, Silviana pushing for reforms that prioritized care over control, while Theron struggled against instincts ingrained over centuries. They fought about his tendency to make decisions unilaterally, about her habit of wandering into dangerous situations without backup, about the fundamental differences in how they viewed the world and their place in it. But they also learned to compromise, to find middle ground between her idealism and his pragmatism, to build something new from the broken pieces of their separate pasts. Silviana used her powers to revitalize the kingdom's farmlands, teaching his people sustainable practices that worked with nature rather than against it. She established healing groves where the sick and injured could recover surrounded by plants, tailored to accelerate regeneration. She created living walls around vulnerable settlements, barriers that would defend against invasion while providing food and shelter for those who lived within their protection. Theron supported these initiatives while maintaining the military strength needed to deter those who might see compassion as weakness, proving that mercy and might need not be mutually exclusive. He began the slow process of reforming laws that his father had used to terrorize and control, seeking justice over vengeance, rehabilitation over punishment, where possible. He established councils that gave voice to ranks beyond the alpha elite, creating pathways for concerns and grievances to be heard before they festered into rebellion. Their bonding ceremony took place not in the palace, but in the forest clearing where Theron had first found Silviana, witnessed by the trees that had raised her and the warriors who had followed him through hell. She wore a dress woven from living flowers that bloomed and changed with her emotions, while he came in the simple leather and linen of a warrior rather than the ornate robes of kingship. The vows they exchanged were their own, promises to challenge and support each other, to choose partnership over dominance, to build something better than what had come before. When Theron kissed his mate for the first time, the forest erupted with life around them, flowers blooming in impossible profusion, trees dropping their seeds in celebration, animals emerging from hiding to bear witness. The bond solidified into something unbreakable, a connection that would endure beyond death if the old stories about Silvani were true. And Theron felt the final walls around his heart crumble into dust. In the months that followed, word spread of the Alpha King, who had mated with a creature of legend, who had brought the Forbidden Forest itself into alliance with his kingdom. Other Alphas approached with requests for similar partnerships, hoping to gain access to Silviana's knowledge and power. She agreed to teach those who came seeking wisdom, sharing techniques for working with the land, for establishing balance between progress and preservation. A new generation began to emerge, one that saw nature not as a resource to be conquered, but as a partner to be respected. But peace, Theron had learned long ago, was always temporary in a world built on tooth and claw. The threat emerged from an unexpected direction when scholars deciphering ancient texts discovered references to a ritual that could supposedly grant the power of the Silvani to anyone willing to pay the price. The spell required the willing sacrifice of the last pure-blooded Silvani, their essence harvested and distributed among those who participated in the ceremony. Whoever had ordered the hunting of Silviana's people 1,000 years ago had been seeking this ritual, and now, with news of her existence spreading, those same dark forces were beginning to stir again. Theron received warnings from allies and spies about a coalition forming, mages and rogue alphas united by the promise of power beyond imagining. They were gathering in the eastern wastes, amassing forces for an assault they believed would succeed where the ancient hunters had failed, because this time they knew exactly where to find their target. Silviana faced the news with a calm that terrified Theron more than panic would have, saying that she had always known this day would come, that being the last of anything made you a target for those who believed they could own what was rare. She refused to run or hide, saying that she was done letting fear dictate her choices, that she would stand and fight for the life she had built and the people she had come to love. Theron wanted to forbid her involvement, to lock her somewhere safe and face the threat himself. But he knew such actions would destroy everything they had built together, would reduce their partnership to another form of the control and domination he had spent years trying to unlearn. Instead, they prepared for war together, combining her knowledge of ancient magic with his tactical expertise and modern weaponry. Silviana spent weeks strengthening the forest's defenses, creating barriers and traps that would make invasion costly even if it succeeded. She worked with Theron's mages to develop countermeasures against the ritual, finding ways to disrupt the specific harmonics and components needed for the spell to function. She taught his warriors how to fight alongside nature rather than just in it, how to read the forest's warnings and use terrain as a weapon. Theron gathered his allies, calling in every favor and making promises he hoped he would live to fulfill, assembling a coalition to match the one arrayed against them. The waiting was the hardest part, knowing the attack would come but not when, seeing Silviana push herself to exhaustion, preparing defenses while maintaining the brave face she wore for the sake of kingdom morale. Theron found himself praying to gods he was not sure he believed in, making desperate bargains in the darkness of his chambers, offering anything if only she would survive what was coming. The mate bond had changed him in ways he was still discovering, had given him something to lose after a lifetime of holding everything at arm's length, and the prospect of losing her was more terrifying than any battle he had ever faced. The attack came on the winter solstice, when the barrier between worlds grew thin and magic ran strongest. 5,000 warriors backed by 100 mages marched on Theron's kingdom, under banners that had not been seen in centuries, symbols of the dark cabal that had hunted Silvani to the edge of extinction. Theron met them, with 4,000 of his own, every warrior who could hold a weapon or cast a spell, knowing that this battle would determine not just the fate of his kingdom, but the future of the entire realm. The forest itself fought alongside them, animated by Silviana's will, trees becoming soldiers and roots becoming weapons, the earth rising up in defense of the last child of its ancient guardians. The battle raged for 3 days and nights, the longest sustained combat Theron had experienced in 2 centuries of warfare, pushing him and his forces to the absolute limits of endurance. He fought at the front lines, leading charges and holding breaches, his wolf form drenched in blood both enemy and his own, refusing to fall while Silviana still stood. She was everywhere at once, it seemed, shoring up collapsing defenses with walls of living wood, healing the wounded fast enough to send them back into battle, unleashing nature's fury on clusters of enemies that pressed too close to victory. But the mages were cunning, and they had prepared specifically for her intervention. They unleashed a spell designed to sever Silviana's connection to the forest, cutting her off from the source of her power in a moment of perfect timing, when she was already exhausted from days of sustained effort. Theron felt her pain through the mate bond like a knife to his own heart, felt her stumble as the forest went silent around her, for the first time in her life. He abandoned his position at the front, racing toward where she knelt, gasping in the mud, arriving just as enemy warriors closed in for the kill. He stood over her in full wolf form, larger than any beast had a right to be, and he roared a challenge that made the earth shake and the sky darken with gathering storm clouds. What followed was less a fight than a massacre, Theron unleashing every ounce of violence and fury he had spent years learning to control, giving himself over entirely to the protective rage of a mate whose bond had been threatened. He tore through enemy ranks like paper, his claws and teeth finding flesh and bone with brutal efficiency, painting the ground red in a circle around Silviana's fallen form. His warriors, inspired by their alpha's savage defense, surged forward in a renewed assault that broke the enemy's cohesion and sent them reeling backward. The mages tried to complete their ritual, even as their army collapsed, attempting to harvest Silviana's essence while she lay weakened and disconnected from her power, but they had not accounted for the mate bond, for the way Theron's own alpha magic had entwined with her Silvani essence over months of growing connection. When they tried to pull her power away, they got his too, and the combination proved too volatile for the spell to contain. The backlash from the failed ritual killed half the mages instantly, their bodies simply disintegrating as power they could not control consumed them from within. The rest fled, abandoning their army and their ambitions, broken by the failure of a plan generations in the making. The surviving enemy warriors threw down their weapons, begging for mercy from an alpha king who had just demonstrated exactly why his people called him Breaker of Chains and Death's Shadow. Theron granted it, exhausted beyond measure and desperate to return to Silviana, leaving his beta to handle the surrender terms and prisoner processing. He found her still kneeling where he had left her, staring at her hands as if seeing them for the first time, tears cutting tracks through the dirt and blood on her face. She told him in a broken whisper that the forest was still silent, that she could not feel the trees or hear their songs, that the mages had succeeded in severing something essential that she did not know how to repair. Theron gathered her into his arms, carrying her from the battlefield to the forest edge, where she had always felt safest, hoping that proximity to her home would help facilitate healing. They stayed there for 3 days, Theron keeping watch while Silviana lay in a kind of suspended state between sleep and waking, her body present, but her spirit seeming to wander in realms he could not follow. On the 3rd day, The forest began to sing again, softly at first, then growing in volume and complexity until the entire woodland thrummed with welcome and relief. Silviana opened her eyes, silver once more instead of the dull gray they had faded to, and breathed in the scent of living. Earth with an expression of such profound gratitude that Theron found his own eyes burning with unshed tears. The connection had not been severed after all, he learned, but rather forced into hibernation, while Silviana's body and spirit recovered from the trauma of separation. The mate bond with Theron had served as a tether, keeping her anchored to the physical world while she healed in the deep places where forest and spirit intertwined. She emerged from the experience changed, her power somehow deeper and more controlled, as if the temporary loss had taught her to value and understand what she possessed. Theron, too, had been transformed by those 3 days of watching her struggle, by the terror of thinking he might lose her, by the realization that his strength meant nothing if it could not protect what he loved most. They returned to the palace as different people than they had been before the battle. The final pieces of their old selves burned away in the crucible of war and near loss. The reconstruction took months, rebuilding what had been destroyed, healing what had been broken, integrating the lessons learned through blood and sacrifice. Theron worked with his mate to completely restructure how his kingdom functioned, moving away from the rigid hierarchical model his father had enforced, toward something more collaborative and sustainable. Silviana established a school for those interested in learning earth magic, passing on knowledge that had been in danger of dying with her, ensuring that even if she fell, the wisdom of her people would survive. Together they created laws protecting wild spaces, establishing boundaries between civilization and wilderness that both sides agreed to respect, proving that coexistence was possible when approached with good faith and mutual respect. Life settled into a new rhythm, no less challenging than before, but rich with purpose and meaning that had been absent from Theron's existence for most of his life. He discovered that he enjoyed building instead of just destroying, creating instead of simply maintaining order through force. Silviana helped him understand that true leadership meant empowering others rather than controlling them, that a kingdom built on trust and mutual benefit was stronger than one held together by fear. She also helped him confront the guilt and shame he carried from his past, from the violence that had marked his path, and the lives he had taken in the name of justice or survival. She did not absolve him of responsibility, but rather taught him that redemption was not a destination, but a continuous journey, that becoming better required daily recommitment and constant vigilance against backsliding into old patterns. Theron found himself laughing more, something his people remarked on with wonder and cautious optimism, taking joy in simple things he had never allowed himself to appreciate before. Watching Silviana coax impossible flowers into bloom in the palace gardens, listening to her sing to the trees in the evening, feeling her presence through the mate bond, even when they were rooms apart, these became the anchors of his existence in ways that power and control had never been. Years passed in this manner, marked by seasons of growth and harvest, by challenges met and overcome, by the slow accumulation of small victories that added up to fundamental change. Theron's kingdom became known not for the strength of its warriors, though they remained formidable, but for the wisdom of its rulers and the prosperity of its people. Other alphas came seeking guidance, asking how to replicate the balance Theron and Silviana had achieved between progress and preservation. She welcomed them all, sharing knowledge freely, believing that the more who understood earth magic and sustainable practices, the safer the world would be for her kind, should any others still survive in hiding. Theron supported her mission while maintaining realistic awareness that not everyone could be trusted, that there would always be those who saw power as something to exploit rather than steward responsibly. Together, they walked the line between optimism and caution, hope and preparedness, creating something that honored both their natures. The question of children arose eventually, as it always did with mated pairs, and brought with it complications neither had anticipated. Silviani were not meant to breed with other species, or so the ancient texts claimed, their essence too different from wolf or human or any other known form. But the mate bond had changed both of them at a fundamental level, Theron's magic taking on some of Silviana's connection to the earth, while her power grew more focused and directed under his influence. When Silviana finally conceived after years of trying, the pregnancy was unlike anything the palace healers had seen, marked by strange symptoms and magical fluctuations that had everyone terrified something would go wrong. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath through those 9 months, the trees growing still and watchful, animals gathering at the kingdom's borders as if waiting for some significant event. Theron barely left Silviana's side, his wolf pacing restlessly through the mate bond, driven by instincts to protect that went beyond reason or logic. The birth happened during a spring storm, thunder shaking the palace walls and lightning illuminating the sky in brilliant flashes. And when their daughter finally emerged crying into the world, the rain stopped and a rainbow arched across the sky from horizon to horizon. She had Theron's dark hair and sharp features, but Silviana's silver eyes, and when the midwife placed her in her mother's arms, flowers bloomed spontaneously throughout the room, responding to the new life that carried both wolf and Silvani essence in her tiny body. They named her Elara, after the ancient Silvani word for hope, and as Theron held his daughter for the first time, he understood in a way he never had before why his mate fought so fiercely for a better world. This child would inherit a kingdom shaped by the choices they made, would face challenges born from their successes and failures, and he wanted desperately to give her a realm where power served justice rather than the other way around. Elara grew up wild and loved, running through forests that bent to her will and palace corridors where warriors taught her to fight and defend. She had her father's tactical mind and her mother's compassionate heart, and by the time she was 5 years old, it was clear she would be something entirely new, a bridge between worlds that had spent millennia in conflict or isolation. More children followed over the years, each unique in how they expressed the mingled magic of their parentage, each adding new dimensions to the legacy Theron and Silviana were building. The family they created became the foundation for everything else, the reminder of why reform mattered, why protecting the vulnerable was worth the cost, why choosing hope over cynicism was not naive, but rather the bravest possible stance. Theron, looking back on his life from the perspective of centuries, would identify the moment he decided to investigate the Forbidden Forest as the true beginning of his story. Everything before that just prologue to the real work of becoming someone worthy of the love and trust Silviana had given him. She had saved him in ways that had nothing to do with magic or power, had shown him that strength could be gentle and gentleness could be strong, that the past did not have to define the future if you were willing to do the hard work of change. If this story has moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Which moment resonated most deeply with you? What would you like to see in future stories? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more supernatural romance tales. Your engagement helps these stories reach others who need them. Thank you for being part of this community. Epilogue. 20 years after the battle that nearly ended everything, Theron stood once more at the edge of the Forbidden Forest, but this time he was not alone. Silviana held his hand, her silver eyes sparkling with the same ancient wisdom they had held when he first saw her dancing in that impossible clearing, though now they also held warmth and humor earned through decades of partnership. Their children ranged through the trees behind them, the oldest leading the youngest, teaching them the ways of the forest their mother had been forced to learn alone. The kingdom had become something unrecognizable from what Theron's father had ruled, transformed not through revolution, but through persistent, patient reformation, guided by the principles he and Silviana had hammered out together through trial and error. Other Silvani had emerged from hiding over the years, drawn by rumors of one of their kind living openly and thriving, carefully testing whether the world had finally become safe enough for them to return. A small community now existed on the border between Theron's kingdom and the forest, neither fully wild nor fully civilized, but something in between. A new way of being that honored both sides of their heritage. Theron had lived long enough to see the seeds they planted grow into forests of their own, to watch the children they raised become leaders in their own right, to know that the world they left behind would be better than the one they had inherited. He had learned that redemption was not about erasing the past, but about building a future that honored the lessons learned through failure and pain. Silviana had learned that strength came not from isolation but from community, that her power was meant to be shared rather than hoarded, that being the last of something did not mean being alone. Together they had proven that even the most broken things could be healed if given enough time and care, that love was not weakness, but the foundation upon which all other strengths were built, and that choosing compassion over cruelty was not naive, but revolutionary in a world that too often defaulted to violence. As they walked into the forest with their children's laughter echoing through the trees and the mate bond singing between their hearts, Theron knew with certainty that he had found what he had been searching for, without knowing since the night he killed his father and took the throne. Not power or control or fear-induced obedience, but purpose, partnership, and the profound peace that comes from building something worth protecting with someone who sees all your flaws and loves you anyway. The forest whispered its approval, the trees bowing in recognition not of dominance but of respect, and somewhere deep in the ancient heartwood, new seeds were already beginning to grow.